Welcome everyone to Agriculture Policy in a Time of Uncertainty. This is the Slow Living Summit virtual. We're going to give a few moments for folks to join us before we start. You can see the numbers going up as people are joining. Still going up. I'll wait a few more seconds for folks to join. Still going up. That's good. Good sign. Lots of interest. Okay. So my name is Alyssa Harris. I'm the Executive Director of Strolling of the Heifers, and welcome to our first ever virtual Slow Living Summit. We are in day 4 of our summit, and today's panel is on agriculture policy in a time of uncertainty. Certainly, this is a time of uncertainty for a lot of us. Just a few little housekeeping notes. We put out a statement, Slow Living Summit put out a statement in support of Black Lives Matter on our Facebook page. And we did get some pretty negative and racist comments on that post. So I just want to put a reminder out to folks that those comments will not be tolerated, either in our chat or in our Q&A. And anyone who does put out negative racist comments or incites violence will be removed from the webinar. Every single panel has been fantastic. Everyone's been great. I don't anticipate a problem, but I felt that we do need to put that out there. I want to thank our sponsors, first and foremost, Breakthrough Beverage and Meadows Beef Farm, for allowing us to put on this summit, even though we weren't able to get together in person. We've been doing this all virtually, and it's been really fantastic. I'm going to introduce now our moderator for the day is Theresa Snow. Teresa's worked in Vermont Ag for the last 20 years and founded Salvation Farm. I'm going to let her tell you about herself because she knows herself the best. So take it away, Theresa.
Great. Thank you. It's an honor to be here at the Slow Living Summit and to moderate this panel of incredible individuals, folks that are doing work that I admire and look up to. So as I want to call you Lisa. As Lisa said, I am Theresa Snow. I'm the founder and the executive director of Salvation Farms. We are an organization that advocates for food system resilience, and our approach, or I should say the lever in which we approach building food system resilience, is by looking at edible surplus foods that often remain on farms, but that could be consumed by people, and that is often through supply chain inefficiencies in which that food does not leave farms and make it to people. So before we move on to the panelists, I'm just going to pull a few things out of the intro to the session. Again, the title is Agricultural Policy in a Time of Uncertainty. The intro included, what does the future of feeding ourselves look like when faced with pressing issues of climate change and a global pandemic? And now, not that it didn't exist before, but this coupled with rising demand for racial and social justice. While the global food supply has become increasingly consolidated, productive, and wasteful, its destruction of ecological, social, and economic systems has also increased. So I'm pleased to be able to just turn this over to our panelists so that they can introduce themselves, providing their name, their business or organizational affiliation, as well as a few statements about what alignment you each have to this topic. And I'll let you each open up your mics at your own time.
Do you care who goes first?
No, you're welcome.
Well, I am the male. Maybe we could have one of the others go first.
Chivalry.
Nice. Okay, David, I can go first. Hi, everybody. My name is Caroline Gordon. I'm the legislative director of a small advocacy organization based here in Vermont called Rural Vermont. And as the legislative director, of course, I'm doing basically, I'm trying to change the law to go towards this goal, I would say, towards the future of feeding ourselves in times of uncertainty and climate change. And just to make a quick reference to the criminal justice movement, I've been visiting a local rally just over the weekend and been blown away by the power behind it and how inspiring the words were. There, I cannot speak as eloquently to that issue, but just noticing the fact that, you know, these people have, at least people on that weekend, you know, been doing this work for a long time, and it's affecting change. You know, it takes persistence and commitment. And I hope that the current wave of demonstrations can just spark that inspiration so that more and more people are committed and persistent on this issue. Back to my particular work. My background is I'm half German. So I've studied environmental law as an undergraduate bachelor's in Germany. And when that was at a time where basically my worldview just developed, and I just learned about environmental degradation, loss of biodiversity, water quality issues, and so on and so forth. And I was answering this question back then, okay, so if I just become a farmer, an organic farmer who does everything right, you know, and takes agency for the environment, maybe then I can affect the change. So I did in Germany, there's only one organic training program. So that's one issue. So if you want to become an organic farmer, can you get that education at all? And that is in Germany a program for biodynamic farmers. And many Americans don't really know what that means. It's a form of farming that that receives, at least on the German market, the highest tier of organic prices, because these are not just organic farmers, but they work biodynamically, and that means, you know, they work according to the moon cycles, and they have homeopathic substances that they produce themselves, and that they apply on the fields and the produce that enhance the health of the plants. And they generate the highest tier prices on the market. So one might say maybe these farmers are well off and have something that we would call farm viability. And they don't, you know, they still rely on cheap labor to make it work, on many voluntary hands, you know, suffer similar economic struggles than other farmers. And so I was motivated back then. So if even those farmers can't really make it work for themselves and drown under their debt, so maybe the law has to change. And I remembered, you know, okay, I have already this privilege of having this legal education. Let me continue that and focus on food and agriculture law. And as one might think, in times of climate change, that is an easy thing to do then, because everybody knows how agriculture contributes to climate change, and how important it is to rethink agriculture. Yet the law is antiquated, and legal education is usually based on how the law is and not how you can make policy to change the law. So the vast majority of legal education programs out in the world don't even think about agriculture or agricultural policy. So in the entire world, I could not find a program to educate me on food and agricultural policy other than the Vermont Law School here in the US that has a series of programs focused on progressive issues, restorative justice being one of them, just to make that bridge once more. And yeah, with a progressive agenda. So I did that track there and got stuck here in Vermont because I just think that, you know, Vermont is a bubble, a small state in a bubble for that reason, but it's part of the US, and the world looks at the US, and when the world looks at the US, then the world also looks on Vermont. GMO labeling has made that case, and thank you to the Lieutenant Governor on that end. And I think, and there is in Vermont, you know, there is a different common sense on what kind of progressive policy is necessary. And one might think in Bubble, Vermont, we're already safe haven. But when you look at the farm to plate networks numbers on where we are in terms of local food consumption, for example, then you would be surprised that that number is still under 15% currently. So we have a long ways to go, and we need commitment and persistence.
Thanks, Carolyn. Lynn,
Lindsay?
Sure, I'll take the next one. Hi, I'm Lindsey Berk. I work with ACORN, the Addison County Relocalization Network. We're a tiny nonprofit that has 2 part-time consultants and a volunteer board. And we're really working to strengthen the local food economy around the Champlain Valley. So moving beyond just Addison County, but really looking at the food shed as the watershed and beyond the geographical boundaries of counties. In addition to my work with ACORN, I'm a small business owner. I run a tiny business called Origins of Food that hosts international service learning trips focused on agritourism with the idea we're reconnecting people with where food comes from. We believe that if people understand the amount of work that goes into growing food, people might want to become more active consumers, more conscious consumers, and perhaps become more advocates in their own home communities, focusing on food justice issues, racial justice issues. As Caroline said, it's all connected. My path to the good food movement was not through education. I went corporate after college, and after spending 7 years in the advertising and PR world, I realized how corrupt and empty it was, and I went traveling, and I was really privileged to be able to go live in Latin America and work on a vineyard and work in coffee cooperatives in Guatemala, and really start to investigate the globalized food industry and how our purchases at home really affect the global South and how unfair the globalized food system is. And so Origins of Food was created really with this idea of educating people on the ground, because, you know, personal stories really tell a lot more than just statistics, and the news is really skewed. So, you know, it's on hold right now with COVID-19. We've had to pivot to try to figure out what that looks like today. So in addition to that work, I've become an agritourism consultant here in Vermont. I'm working with some small local organic farmers, and I'm also a climate activist. I'm part of the Extinction Rebellion movement, and you know, all of this work is super related. And I'm not a policy person, but I'm happy to be here and talk about food justice as racial justice and intersectional environmentalism, and I'm really happy to be on this panel.
Lindsay, I have to say I really enjoyed the birds too that are with you.
I have to be outside the days that I can be.
It's great.
I'm from Florida, so I've got to, you know, I need as much sunshine as I can get.
Yeah.
All right, I'm David Zuckerman. I'm both Lieutenant Governor and also organic farm owner operator with my wife Rachel Nevitt at Full Moon Farm here in Heinsberg. And before I say a little bit more about myself, my thoughts on this topic, I just want to say that Lindsey, as an educator and advocate, you are also a policymaker. My efforts over the years, well, geez, I don't even know where to start. So I was an environmental studies major at UVM, and it was as an environmental studies student that I really learned a lot about agricultural's impact on our environment, from water quality, soil health, to the climate crisis. And it really sort of turned me on to the opportunity of agriculture as a way of life that would be both something that would exercise my mind, exercise my body, and be a practice and a profession that lived with the values that I cared about. And of course, while at UVM, I saw Bernie Sanders speak, and while I was quite cynical about the policy process and the election process and policymakers, I felt that here was someone that didn't take corporate money and wore his politics on his sleeve, and I could put my volunteerism behind his effort, and through that met other people who cared a lot about a range of issues. So while I came to politics from an environmental perspective, the connection between economic injustice, the climate, racial injustice, gender inequity, so many of these issues, affordable housing, it just really came together as, oh, it's like the web of life. You don't pull on one strand of policy, whether it be about environment or agriculture or social injustice, without seeing how they're all interconnected in the web. So got involved with that, and lo and behold, now 20 whatever years later, I'm lieutenant governor. So I pinch myself for that bizarreness. But in terms of ag policy, I think there's so much, and Caroline talked about GMO, labeling, and gave me a shout out for that. And I just sat there while she was talking. I was thinking about, right, and Ellen Taggart, who was head of rural Vermont and worked with me on that, and Amy Schollenberger and Andrea Stander, and then people who weren't involved with rural Vermont but were active around the state, from Susan Davidson and then down in Brattleboro, Peter Cooper and his spouse, whose name I'm forgetting at the moment, and Will Allen and Kate Duesterberg. I mean, there are people all over the state, Kat Buxton, who are what made that policy happen. And I think that ties into why I gave a shout out to Lindsey too, because yes, those of us who are in elected office can help put a voice to and advocate for and have power inside the political structure to try to make something happen. Ag policy and the future of food and food policy really happens from the grassroots level that's out there. And I think the term even grassroots is really cool, because grass and roots, that's plants and digging down into things, which is really what agriculture is all about, and soil, which is what organic agricultural is about. And we could get into the Real Organic Project and hydroponics and organics, and we can go anywhere here. But when I think about ag policy, and I think about this international food system that Lindsey was referencing, and I think about the drive for efficiencies and cheap food, which has really been US driven and then globally driven policy really since World War II, the goal of cheap food is completely understandable. It's to make sure people are fed, which is about as fundamental a basic need as we have, along with the ability to breathe. And I think you all know why I'm stating that reference, and water and shelter. But cheap food also has a tremendous impact. It has an impact on health inequality, which is also racially clear in terms of discrepancy. It has to do with water quality, which is impacting everybody. It has to do with toxic application of chemicals, which impacts workers, and those workers who are exploited that Caroline was talking about, in terms of low cost labor that can't even afford to live on what they earn. So we could go into really a lot of directions here, but when I think about Vermont, I think about the COVID crisis, I think about food security, and I think about how Vermont is the most single commodity dependent state in the country. What I mean by that is our agricultural dollars in Vermont come from one commodity more than any other, unlike any other state. Dairy is now about 70 to 75% of the agricultural dollars in Vermont. Used to be 85%. And in this country, no other state is above 50%. And for anybody who wants to talk about diversity, whether it's in people or economics or agriculture, we are so much healthier with more diversity, more perspectives, and that's also true with agriculture. And so I think we have to look at expanding diversity and quantities of ag grown for our basic needs. We have to look at storage, because frankly, the amount of food that we produce relative to what we consume, if we're looking at the potential with pandemics or climate crisis and energy to move food, that we have to look at how far is food traveling. So we have to look at storage and processing, and the ability, as I know Caroline knows well, the ability to direct market on-farm slaughtered animal products and so forth. So I throw all of that out there because we could really go in any direction, and I've probably been talking too long already. So we'll get to other topics like universal healthcare another time. But thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's fabulous to have you all, and to for the depth of which you shared. I think I'm going to skip some of my initial intro questions and kind of get right into the meat of some of the other questions. And you're right, Lieutenant Governor. There's so many directions that this conversation could go, and I'm having a hard time picking which question to go with, because I have quite a few that we could go deep on. I think the first, because it feels relevant to the moment, love to hear opinions on, how can agricultural and food supply policy support the need for increased equity and racial justice in America?
Well, I'll take a quick stab at it while we're all thinking, because that's so important and deep of a question. And I was thinking about, not all agriculture is food. So when we look at cannabis policy, for instance, we've had a racist war on drugs for a long time, and we have a disproportionate number of people incarcerated of color, particularly from the war on drugs, and racist policies around particularly actually cannabis, with Nixon trying to suppress the civil rights movement and the peace movements of the 60s. And as we move into a legal cannabis world, both from a CBD and a THC perspective, we can look at what of those resources that are earned from or paid in taxes from either of those worlds could be utilized to make sure agricultural opportunities, particularly in the cannabis industry, but in any agricultural industry, are made available to help with the wealth transfer that we've seen over the last 400 years, but even more directly in some, it's been direct the whole time, but there's been policy out of World War II that directed wealth benefits to veterans that were white and not veterans that were black. There's been redlining. And so we need to look at access to land and make sure land is available, and equipment, education. So there's a few things on even the non-food side in terms of the production or the business side. But then we also have to look at food access and healthy food access, and why is healthier produced food like organic food more expensive than cheap food, and who has access to the diversity of vegetables and other agricultural products that lead to healthier lives versus more processed food. So there's policy questions there in terms of where are agricultural subsidies going? Should they be on the production side of cheap food, or should they be on the purchasing side so people can buy healthy food? And so there's all kinds of topics to delve into. And I don't know if Lindsey and Caroline join in.
Yeah, I mean, I can just echo what you mentioned regarding the cannabis bill. We've been advocating for S54 to basically leave out criminal penalties. There was still in the bill incarceration part. We think with legalization of cannabis, incarceration should be totally off the table, and anyone incarcerated currently because of nonviolent charges should be relieved. Related to COVID, just now, one of the campaigns we've been pushing is, there's a lot of stimulus money, but anyone with immigrant background does not have access to those funds. So one of the very first focuses of our COVID-related advocacy was to work with Migrant Justice and Susanna Davis, the she is the diversity director from the administration, to work with her and Migrant Justice on a program that would basically fill that gap and provide some funding for all those Vermonters with a immigrant background to also have relief funding. So, and equity is really one of rural Vermont's core values, and we experience now, you know, David, you just mentioned the dollar importance of dairy farms to our ag sector, and it's weird though, because of the total number of farms in Vermont, the majority are not dairy farms anymore, and yet our Agency of Agriculture is very clearly prioritizing being an agency for the dairy sector, and that's why in the administration's proposal for relief funding, any diversified farmer didn't even find a home or consideration. So we currently very strongly working with NOFA Vermont and others, and environmental groups have also been being loud, but we're working on just getting equity in terms of access to even filing an application and even being able to show that also other farms have had losses and expenses related to the crisis. That is a matter of equity for us. And I know some have been, you know, there's some hurt and some are really hurting, and there's differences, and that's not the question, but just having a simple right and equitable access to being able to just being heard and making yourself known, that is not the case right now. So we're working on that.
So something that comes to mind, last year I interviewed Lydia Clemens from the Clemens Family Farm up in Charlotte, and she is one of very few Black farmers who own Black farmland in the state of Vermont. And if you look at the numbers across the country, 1.3% of today's farmers are Black, according to the USDA, and only 0.52% of America's farmland is owned by Black farmers, compared to 95% of farmers being white. So I think those numbers alone, you know, that tells a whole story, and the racism that is within our farming communities, it's astounding, and it's institutional and it's systemic. And how can we start getting more land into the hands of Black farmers? You know, Leah Penniman at Soul Justice Farm is doing an amazing job. They're training new generations of Black farmers and farmers of color. And how can we promote that more through policy? How can we help young farmers access more land? You know, I'm in my mid-30s, and my generation is totally outpriced for buying land, whether you're white or a person of color. So how can we really start transitioning the land away from these big dairies, and maybe we start creating commons where you see younger farmers and you see farmers of color being incentivized to come to Vermont, because, you know, we're all saying we need more young people, but the young people that are coming from the cities because they can work remotely, and it's not necessarily the people that are coming to work the land. So there's a lot of opportunity here with COVID, and with all of the racial inequities being, you know, magnified. And I think that this is a really ripe topic to be talking about. And something else that I would like to talk about, I guess, would be the essential workers. The essential workers tend to be people of color or women, and those are people who are putting their lives at risk to work in kitchens or to deliver food, and things that other people don't want to do, and they don't have access to healthcare, and they don't have paid sick leave. So here they are going, and in the slaughterhouses, we've all read the numbers of what's happening in the slaughterhouses, and who's working in the slaughterhouses? Migrant farm workers or migrant workers, and mostly people of color. So I don't know, I think we could talk about this for the whole session, and I don't know if we should, or
that could be.
And that term essential workers, I think that is such an interesting moment in time that we're in with the COVID crisis, in that many people who are financially much better off are rallying around the concept of essential workers, and yet we've been unable to put economic policies in place that actually remunerate financial reward or even any kind of economic bump for the quote essential workers. I just think we are in a very amazing moment, depending on which way we go with respect to rebuilding this economy, to say, if this is essential, why isn't it valued with pay the way that an essential person should be? And that's, I think, true across a range of things. So related to this topic, but in this moment, we have an opportunity, if we continue these conversations and we're loud about it, to make those policies, since this is about ag and policy, that could actually start to change some of that.
Well, I have
just a last comment also, just taking really the moment of everyone being thoughtful and inspired right now to think about racial justice. Yeah, finding out more about the groups of people of color and that are working on these ag issues and finding out how to support them. I think you said, Lindsay, putting the dollars in those hands, and that was also one of our initial thoughts. What can we do right away? And that is, we've donated some money to I don't know if you know the group. It's a land trust of people of color, and we talked about land access as being something difficult as well. So this is a New England-based land trust specifically for people of color, and they're doing good work. And we also, Rural Vermont always has a 10% contingent just capacity we want to devote to issues that are intersectional. We were talking about healthcare very tiny little bit, and now we also more and more thinking about how we can also put as part of our advocacy, intersectional, this particular issue. And there are actually a couple of bills in the run, and I'm just saying the numbers once for everyone to write down with me, because these bills need our support now. I'm not sure how feasible it is in terms of virtual legislation, but if not this year, then they surely come back next biennium. So it's H518 and H464, I think they're related, and H478, and there it's about police collecting racial data and such, and just some more racial justice on that end. And yeah, check out those bills and promote them by calling your legislators if you want to show some support in policy for racial justice.
great, and we can probably put those numbers in the chat as well, maybe.
I can do that.
Okay, great. I'm going to stick on this workforce topic for just a minute and lead another round of dialogue before moving into another area. So, local employment and a skilled, valued workforce earning livable wages with access to healthcare are crucial to building a relocalized food shed in which farms, manufacturers, distributors, food service, and retailers must be seen as essential. With other questions revolving around infrastructure to meet a region's food needs, we must not forget about the employment needs of a population. The dignity and training deserved by employees filling critical food supply chain roles. What can policy do to ensure that these jobs are valued, well-paying, and that training is appropriate and provided to the individuals seeking food sector employment?
I have thoughts again, but I went first last time, so I don't know if you two are ready. You've got something to chime in.
The obvious things that would come to mind are the minimum, living wage of at least $15 or more, healthcare for all, paid sick leave, all of the the standard responses maybe that Bernie Sanders would have given if he was on this call. But I'll pass along the torch.
Well, I fully agree. As a farm operator and owner, I'm going to also reveal the challenges of all of that. On our farm, we have 3 H2A workers, which this year the wage in this area is $14.29 an hour. So the lowest paid worker on our farm gets $14.29, which is a few dollars above minimum wage. And last year, our farm lost $100,000. And my wife made about $31,000. I didn't make any from the farm side because while I work a lot on the farm, figure since I'm more focused on LG, and she manages so much, make her get as much of the pay as possible that the farm can pay us. But there is an economic reality to agricultural operations that if we don't address people having enough money to buy the food at the price that it takes to pay those wages and pay people dignified and livable wages and grant people either the wages and or the benefits within the cost realities of a lowest cost capitalist structure, it would actually be really hard for most farms in Vermont to survive. And there is a notion and a belief that organic food being more expensive must mean there's big profits. Well, the input costs are higher when you don't spray your whole field with one chemical to wipe out pests, but you put row cover on and you take row cover off to cultivate and you put row cover on. That's all labor costs to keep pests off your crops till they get big enough. I can give you numerous examples where organic agriculture takes added labor, which is added cost, which is why those products cost more. So, and by the way, I happen to support everything Lindsey said, but I just think it's really important to make sure some folks who may not recognize that side of it, and I talk, you cited Bernie as well, I have real concerns about sort of corporatization, whether it's of agriculture or just the trickle-down methodology of Reaganomics and so forth. But there are some financial realities that without structural changes to policy, Lindsey mentioned, universal health care. Well, if you had universal health care, then the wage dollars wouldn't have to be quite as high because everybody would have health care and you wouldn't be paying for that out of your wages or out of your compensation. What if we, invested more in affordable housing so that people could actually afford to live in Vermont, where we're living in a capitalist system that New Yorkers and Bostonians right now are saying, you know what, I don't want to live in a city anymore. I want to live in a safe place like Vermont. Sight unseen, a Floridian bought a 7-figure property in the Northeast Kingdom. How's Lindsey supposed to buy a farm in Vermont? Or how is a farmer supposed to be able to grow food at a wage that's possible when property values are driven by market competition of New England, New York, where the price of land in Vermont is cheap for New Yorkers and Bostonians, lawyers making $700 an hour. So we're in this really tricky confine, and we do need to do what Lindsey talked about, but we have to be cognizant that that means those people with resources have to also be buying those products at the price it takes to maintain those farms, to be able to pay those workers and practice those soil strategies and healthy strategies for the planet in their agricultural practices.
I totally hear that, David. I was thinking a little bit about, and when I think about young farmers and in terms of training, young folks to go into agriculture, many, especially white kids, would love to, dig in the dirt and become farmers and do things like I did back then and sign up for such a biodynamic farming program. But to be clear, during those 4 years of education, I got paid 50 euro cents an hour, 50 euro cents an hour. So far off from $15. And why? Because the farmers, just like David said, they would not be able to have someone unskilled on site at all if that would cost anything. That most of them were thinking they should get really paid for educating us because that was such a hassle. Most recently, in relation to stimulus funds for migrant workers, we were also advocating for the expansion of the Milk with Dignity program. This is just a good prime example of how you can, through a partnership with a big actor like Ben & Jerry's, receive, have some premium payments to farmers that then in return work for advancing the rights and positions of migrant workers. And I think David is right. Unless we fix basically the viability issue, we can also not fix the labor issue. And that continues on. I mean, even though we would have an educational program similar here in Vermont for young farmers, and young farmers wouldn't get paid much to participate in that program, they will not have the credibility after that training to apply for a loan, but from a bank to get into farmland at all. So farmland access where again, and that issue as well. And that most of our grants and loan programs are only exclusively available for those already in business, and not really a great gateway for those who want to become independent and start their own things. So there we are again with how it's all connected, and a very difficult subject matter that requires lots of food for thought and many small steps that hopefully lead to a long-term improvement for all.
Well, I'm wondering if a solution to this would be having more state-run institutions buy more local food, so we can increase the quantity of food that is bought from local farmers and help bring down the price, so more people can afford the prices of local food. So it's not just the economic elite who can afford the local food, but in turn you're improving the whole local food economy if the colleges and the prison systems and the public schools are all buying directly from local farmers. But for that to happen, we also know we have to improve the storage and aggregation and distribution of small local farmers so they can participate in that. And I wonder if there's room here for that discussion.
I think there is. One of the pieces of that, sorry, Theresa, is that there is, and this is where everybody's involved in policy. Who's elected to office, me or otherwise, it's not about me, makes those decisions. And the pressures on elected folks to be constrained with spending of tax dollars to buy those foods or to invest in those structures makes ideas like this that are great and I think should be fully supported very difficult, because we have sort of a neoliberal mindset that social policy that doesn't cost much money, we can get behind 100%. But as soon as things cost money and would mean that fairly comfortable and extremely comfortable people would have to pay more in taxes to make the system able to do that transfer, they very much back off. That's what the moderate middle is. It's people who support liberal agendas that don't cost money, but as soon as they cost money, they say, oh, but you have to be fiscally responsible and not tax anymore, because that wouldn't be supported. And you say, well, who wouldn't support it? Because if you support it, if you're in that world that can afford more than your basic needs and are a little more comfortable and get to go on a vacation to the Caribbean once a year, or have a second home somewhere, but you're not willing to pay more in taxes to make this possible, then those are great ideas, but the money just isn't there. So we have to convince people who don't think they're comfortable to be more aware of how comfortable they are, and that they could put more into the system to make that possible. Which most politicians aren't willing to say, by the way. I might add.
The conversation's excellent. I keep going back and forth on which question I'm going to ask next, and I keep moving them all in different orders, but I think I'm going to take us in a new direction. Was going to talk about retail in relation to your question, Lindsay. Anyway, but I think, I have a question about conserving or transferring of land. Can local and state governments use public tax dollars to purchase agricultural land to aid in the transition from dairy to other forms of food production, or from one farmer to another? Is this happening? And can it be scaled in combination with land use planning? focused on building agriculture and food industries that can more readily feed a region's population.
I missed the very beginning. Can which money be used for that?
Local and state, which I suspect that some money is going into some of the land trusts, but I'm just kind of curious, like what structures are there to essentially hold agricultural land as such, and doing it in partnership with planning what the population needs for food.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment just to open the discussion faster, and I don't want to speak so long, but I thought initially coming to Vermont that this would be the idea of the land trust, exactly that. But also with that program, you basically run against a wall very shortly because the land trust is not really interested in too small parcels. So I think when we talk about how will the future of agriculture look like, from our perspectives, we find out that we very much want a lot of small farms. It doesn't matter how small, there are cultivation practices that can result in quite some abundance also on small space, out of doubt. So I think there would be an interest to have also smaller parcels be part of the land trust, but that's just not how it, see, that's like one of this many small screws where it just does not work quite as you would think it works. And another one is a farm viability, for example, the farm viability program. Does not have any political guidance on what kind of incentive where they put the dollars and which kind of projects, so that you might incentivize a different type of farming. These are all areas where policy, I hope so, can work to change in direction to some regard.
And I remember this conversation in the Ag Committee, maybe almost 10 years ago, talking about should the land trust and remember, so briefly for people's knowledge, the property transfer tax that applies when a piece of land sells generates, I think it's 1/4 or 0.5% of the sale goes to the property transfer tax, which is supposed to go towards the VHCB portion of the budget, which typically VHCB is Vermont Housing Conservation Board. And that's typically 15 to 25, maybe even $30 million a year, of which half goes to affordable housing and half is supposed to go towards land development right purchases and land conservation for the perpetual use in agriculture or forestry. And there was a debate and discussion about sort of, is it viable to make enough money? I think it was actually around the current use program on a 10-acre piece of land. And I said, well, it all depends. If you're a dairy farm, no, a 10-acre piece of land doesn't really cut it unless you're like someone with 3 Jersey cows and doing the high-end butter that's $8 a pound for some particular restaurant in New York. But that's a pretty unusual situation. But for a strawberry pick your own operation, or a berry farm, or a 5 or 6 acre with rotating crops on 10 acres, diversified vegetable farm, yeah, you can make a living on 10 acres. And so it was a concept 10 years ago that was really outside the norm, because all we think about is dairy. But I do think if you're looking at 10 and 15 acre pieces and you're really talking about feeding Vermont, then you might want 5 or 6 of those within a very close proximity to a storage facility where those farms could grow more food than they sell in the summer and put it up somewhere, where each farm putting up its own, storage facility might be too expensive scale to model. So it would take a lot of thinking and coordinating of some of these efforts. My farm, when I bought it, was originally not conserved, and in my buying it with additional land trust money that went to the prior owner, so they got the full value, and now my farm is conserved for the next person to be able to buy from me at an ag value, is a good thing. But we're even seeing some farms that were conserved a long time ago be bought up by wealthier folks who just want a big piece of land. It doesn't need to be in ag. So now the land trust has started a new part of the contract called the OPAV, option to purchase at ag value, that the land trust or the other holders of the development easements get the right of first refusal to buy a piece of land when it goes on the market at ag value, to make sure it doesn't get bought up by someone who has unlimited coffers. And even though the land can't be developed, they're still willing to pay a top dollar price for it, which if you're someone who bought land without the development rights and you're able to sell it for top dollar, why would you sell it to another farmer when you could sell it for that top dollar? And so new contracts have OPAVs in them, like mine, to really work to keep it perpetually in ag if at all possible. But there's a lot of land that was bought without OPAVs, the development rights prior to that. And so it's so complicated, and we're constantly playing catch up. If we're not working with vision, we're always playing with catch up.
The only thing I have to add is, as somebody who's been actively searching for farmland for about 5 years, I am equally as frustrated with how big the Vermont Land Trust properties are and how expensive they are. And I've seen a solution come up in another nonprofit called the Agrarian Trust. And they've started to form agrarian commons around the country. And it's a really innovative model that will help people with not a lot of money combine efforts and secure pieces of land that could be used for smaller agricultural businesses like you're talking about. And I think that's a really innovative model that maybe perhaps the government could help support, but I'm not sure. And in the meantime, it is happening, you know, in the nonprofit world.
Sorry, I was muted, and there was a request for me to paste the questions I had been asking into the video chat. So if you saw those, sorry if they were distracting. We could go environmental or cultural values. There's so many things to talk about. We could go infrastructure. I think it's really important because, you know, when I think of the three-legged stools of uncertainty in this particular moment in time is pandemic, the climate crisis, and social inequities, likely tied to or tied closely to racial injustices. So I think that we need to transition to the environment. Pretty short question, just how do we ensure policies that pertain to commerce always account for the vital importance of maintaining and growing our soil health and ecological systems? Maybe not growing, but also preserving, maintaining, protecting.
I don't know of any policy related to commerce. You mean just clarifying just agricultural commerce policies specifically, or?
Yeah, when I started to frame this question, I don't think I retained much of it. I think of, you know, commerce tends to prioritize profits over, that is monetary profits over social or environmental profit, which profit just means to benefit or to gain. And so when we think about how we develop, use land, support businesses, how can we make sure that when policies are created that there's some sort of value structure in policy that pertains to commerce and business in our state or nationally, but that we don't lose sight of the fact that we have an obligation and responsibility to the environment, and that our health is reliant on ultimately the health of our soil and living green things.
Well, I would answer that if with my just legal education hat, I think that from when I can answer just from me as a private person, I would answer that question that we actually need to change our constitution, because how our constitution, also in Vermont, the state constitution is written, it's all just about humans. And if we really want that values that are more of a holistic nature have to be considered in any sort of policy decision, then we have to change the constitution. So that's a very tedious process within itself. Beyond that, when we just look at what's happening currently in state legislature on soil health, for example, then we can see that there's also lots of movement. This July, just a couple weeks from now, on July 1st, the universal recycling law will take its final step, which means that every Vermonter will be asked to separate and recycle all food residuals. This is also a tedious process because it's been phased in over at least 8 years. And of course, now that we're in a pandemic, there were also opposing voices whether this is actually feasible to do this final lift in this very moment. But we are still working on the implementation of that law and advancing it, because it's not quite clear what will happen with the food residuals and where they go. There's a management hierarchy that gives basically different tiers, and one of those tiers is agricultural use of food residuals, and of course, we are advocating for, we call it close the nutrient loop. We want food residuals to be returned to farms so that they can serve as a soil enhancement. And yet again, administration has not really been foreseeing that path, since currently food residuals are regulated as solid waste, and you can only imagine how for farmers it's a very it's a new terrain to go into solid waste law and go and acquire permits of that sort and nature, and deal with a separate agency in that regard. So we're trying to make that easier for farms to import food residuals, use it as a forage for their poultry, or just as a composting compound. And that would be huge. I mean, just imagine the law takes effect this year, and just imagine there would be more Vermont farms willing to take those materials. We all know how important compost is for building soil, and that is just a huge amount of material that could be diverted for this very purpose.
Yeah, I think Caroline touched on a number of things there, but one of the strange rules, and it's related partly to the Constitution and so forth, is that no legislature can write rules and laws for the next legislature to have to follow. So the idea of all policy having to go through a lens before it can get to the floor. One legislature can't tell the next legislature 2 years later. They have to use that lens to filter any policy. So the way you develop that lens, the way you make that lens happen, is by building the membership of the legislature with more people that will demand that cycle after cycle. So sometimes there are those, for instance, that think term limits are a good thing. But if you actually do that, you remove institutional memory that gives lobbyists, some of whom are wonderful and fight for good things like Caroline, and others who are fighting against issues like Caroline's fighting for, actually a bigger and bigger voice. And I've been there and seen some lobbyists throw an idea out there and we defeat it, but it looks clever and good and we defeat it. And 10 years later, they try again with a new legislator to introduce an amendment. And those of us who have been there for a while go, oh, we saw that 10 years ago. We know that fight. And we help that legislator learn that what looked clever and good was maybe not so clever and good and was really more helpful to the pharmaceutical industry or the chemical industry. But what you do when you vote for each and every one of your legislators and every one of your senators and each and every one of your elected officials at any level is you build more people that might join a climate solutions caucus or a rural Vermont caucus and so forth, that then that is what develops that lens that some of those issues get filtered through. It doesn't always work. And we're constantly fighting for more people to be in who would look through some of these more broad lenses than sort of singular focused silo lenses of capitalism for profit versus the multiple bottom line and building soil. And, but there's a conversation happening in the legislature now and in the administration around payment for ecosystem services, which is a really big bunch of words for paying farmers to take care of the environment, and it has to be framed in a way that makes it not offensive to people. So it's payment for ecosystem services. So it sounds all highfalutin and fits within sort of capitalistic terminology, when the idea is, should farmers get paid to build soil organic matter? Should farmers get paid to not use chemicals as opposed to get subsidized for using chemicals? But if you say that directly, then the farmers that use those and have relied on them go, whoa, we don't want that. The system, the way it is, works for us. And the majority of farmers still do use extractive policies because that's what they've been taught to use. So shifting the mindset takes everybody's engagement, which I know I've returned to, but that's why I mentioned it about Lindsey. That's why I mentioned it about GMOs, is these things happen because the public supports those shifts. And it's got to be an inside-outside mutual thing. And it's basically people versus corporate lobby money.
Mhm.
And every time a debate happens, that's what's on the two sides of the balance. And when people give up on the system, that gives more power to the corporate chemical company lobby money. And when people say, I'm going to engage in the system, not just voting, but participating with ideas and letting legislators know where you stand on things, which is where grassroots groups like Caroline's and Rural Vermont and others work, that's what tips the balance back in what I would call our direction for those who maybe are in synergy with this conversation.
So I want to just acknowledge that we're just past the 4 o'clock hour. We have a little less than a half hour to wrap this up. We want to open it up to our attendees' questions. Lindsey, did you want to have any?
One quick response is it'd be great if we could have a B corporation as a legal entity instead of just being managed by the nonprofits. I think some states do have B corporations as their legal status. So you do have people, profit, environment. Does Vermont have it?
Yes.
Okay, so making it a national entity. And then to Carolyn's point about changing the constitution, Ecuador did change their constitution in 2008 to recognize nature, the rights of nature in its constitution. So it's not totally impossible. And I think maybe that is something that we should think about.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to go down the list. Again, being mindful that we have about 25 minutes to answer. Right now, we've got 4 questions. Julie is asking, I'm curious if there have ever been bills that propose tax relief to small farmers, given that the high taxes in Vermont are based on acreage and farmer income, typically doesn't reflect their ability to pay higher taxes related to the acreage. So, in fact, we are currently in an unjust tax system based only on average income comparison of large non-farm landholders to farm large landholders. I'm going to paste this in the chat in case I can't copy.
Yeah, I think David already touched on or just mentioned not long ago the current use program, which is, from my perspective, sort of Vermont's attempt to do exactly that. So any agricultural land or land that is an agricultural use, there's a few requirements, but the burdens are not that high, and there's a significant tax break associated with agricultural use of land. So I think that's exactly that incentives. I think it might be able to, and I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm sure it could be better in terms of incentivizing also small scale farming, but it's there.
Actually, it can be utilized on fairly small land, especially when usually smaller acreage operations are more remunerative per acre because they're more intensive for some specialty crops and so forth. But if half of your income is from the business of farming, and that's not net income, that's gross. So that also is a key factor. Then you can enroll the land that you're utilizing in agriculture for the current use program, which statewide, I believe is over $40 million a year in tax relief for agricultural operations. It's one of the more aggressively pro-farming tax relief models in the country. But as Caroline said, there's always room for improvement, but I have to let people know there's usually far more people attacking that program saying we need to use that money for other things in state government. So, you know, in some regards, we're more on the defensive to keep current use going than we are able to expand it. It's a great question, but I'm just letting people know the frustrating political reality of that landscape of what are we paying taxes for and what are we able to support that I referenced earlier.
I like the last question I see. Dorian, how can we get you innovative thinkers down here in Louisiana? All right. That might be a long answer, but it was a short question and a fun one to read out. There is a question specific to the ecosystem services that I do want. It was just liked, so it brought it up to the top. But since that was one of the last items that was being discussed, again, Julie says that this sounds really good, but in the places where they have been tried, it becomes just another market mechanism that gets co-opted by the richest, most powerful farmers. You know, how can we avoid these pitfalls in the payment for ecosystem services plan?
Well, with anything, I think it's how it's structured, and we'd ultimately have to see. So far, there haven't been concrete proposals. It's a sort of nebulous topic that's getting talked about. But with any piece of legislation, there are the opportunity to put parameters on it. So the payments could be based on scale, where the smaller scale gets a higher rate of compensation per, 0.1% organic matter increase for every 5 years. On a 3-acre farm, it might, anything under 5 acres, it might be X dollars. And on 6 through 50 acres, it might be X minus 10% dollars. And on 50 to 51 to 100 acres, it might be X minus, 20%. Any of those kinds of language can be talked about. The question is how to then make sure the political will is there to make that happen. And I believe I've done the broken record thing on how that happens. But, Caroline knows it is really hard to go up against the larger farmland, but there's efficiency issues here. On a 25-acre production farm, I have much more equipment and ability, and a bigger farm, to spread seed, cover crop seed, than maybe a 2-acre farm that might not actually buy a grain drill to put in seeds. So it costs more money to build that soil with cover crops and spread that seed per acre. So there's logical arguments why a smaller farm should get a higher rate of compensation for increasing organic matter. But those arguments have to be made in the committee room, that then have to be bought into by those legislators, and they have to be able to articulate that to the larger body to win that argument on the Senate or House floor in those conversations. So that's a little bit of politics 101 and grassroots organizing, broken record 404.
I'm just going to take a quick moment. And also, I was not introduced at the beginning, but I am Jennifer, just for the folks who are on the call attending. I helped organize this panel, and thank you again, everyone, for speaking. Everyone was wonderful. There's so much. I feel like we can go on for so much longer, but we won't. So I do want to ask something from Orly Munzing, who is the founder of Soil the Heifers. Good friends with Dave, and she has a couple questions. I'm just going to combine into one because it's sort of riffing on the same thing. How can we reduce climate change in agriculture, and how can we use technology to do that? And I would like to ideally hear from everybody, if possible.
I just wanted to add to the previous question still, because that really relates to the work we are doing. That there is a working group, or there was a working group in place, installed by the legislature, and Rural Vermont has successfully advocated to have a diversified farmer on that working group. So that was for us kind of step one, to have eyes and ears in the room when policy debate is taking place. And then after the working group has come forward with their recommendations, we did take the time in terms of grassroots organizing to survey our membership and bounce back the ideas that have been presented and get that feedback in. And now we're trying to work with the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems here in Vermont to really conduct some research about how that could look like, and how it could be easy to maybe use programs that are already in place, that are outdated, that could be broader. And also, you said, how can we counter corporate interest? I think there is indeed, as David has kind of mentioned, in terms of payment for ecosystem services, there are some corporate ideas associated with that. And indeed, it could be understood much more holistically and much more, how you said, much more in general terms. How can policies advance farm viability and environmental soundness? And that's kind of the research we're trying to do in collaboration, and hopefully inform the next round of working group meetings. And in terms of how can technology help to what was the question then again?
Yeah, so it's just sort of addressing how technology can address climate change in agriculture.
So this is basically how it's exactly trickling down in terms of payment for ecosystem services. There is one very, very popular approach that would basically map the entire the entire ecosystem, map that and monitor that through satellites, put it on your smartphone, so that basically the farmer doesn't have to really look at the height of the graph anymore, and whether the soil is wet or not, and whether there's a runoff issue to be avoided or not. But basically your smartphone already tells you that, because you've just mapped the entire ecosystem. So this is the Abe Collins, highly technologically focused approach to payment for ecosystem services. We are not having a clear stance one way or the other on that, but we're, as I just said, we're exploring whether less technology intensive solutions, more based on what the farmers really want, and not what is coming forward from an unknown direction with a lot of force that is very convincing, because they have great PowerPoint presentations to go with it. So I'm rather critical about that technological intense systems, because all these systems always, from my perspective, have to be justified in their own environmental impact. So if we have all of a sudden a system with a bunch of satellites in the universe, and also want other states and countries to have access to the same technology, then we'll really have to weigh if that sort of technologically intense approach is justified or not.
And just a real quick follow-up to that, Julie Snork asks, could you please give us a name for the satellite ecosystem monitoring? Who's developing that? So if you want to put that in the chat, that would be lovely.
I will, thank you.
Yeah, I echo Caroline. I prefer the low-tech solutions as well, whether it's a simple internet that connects farmers directly to the eaters in their region. Acorn created an online farmers market when COVID started coming down and our local farmers markets closed, and it was a way that local eaters could buy directly from local farmers, and that was the simplest solution that we had. And it worked for some farmers. It didn't work for all. So there's an issue if farmers are not technology savvy, then they're not going to be online, they're not going to have e-commerce websites, and they are going to miss out on those opportunities. So how can we help all farmers get on to the web? And another, addressing agriculture and climate change, is we know that animals, that the beef industry and the dairy industry create a lot of methane. So how do we redefine our meat system? How do we decentralize the industrialized meat industry? How do we have more regenerative farming practices? I'm sure David can speak to this. He's got some pretty healthy animals on his farm. I've bought his pork, and I think there's a lot of obvious low-tech solutions. So I try to stay away from the Silicon Valley solutions.
Well, and it's an interesting that the animal agriculture industry and systems are very interesting because grazing animals, I believe, can be a net positive if there's intensive rotational grazing happening and the animals are consuming grass, but not at a rate that denudes the land. And then as they defecate, that material builds the organic matter in the soil, which as those plants are growing, they're sequestering carbon. So it's then a math question of the methane versus carbon sequestration. And I don't know the answers on that. I know there's research out there that I don't know what it says. But also the high tech versus low tech is really interesting because fundamentally, along with animal agriculture and intensive grazing, which we're still trying to improve our practices because we're trying to raise more meat to meet the demand. But in doing so, we're still learning how to rotate the animals better and so forth. So it's constantly a learning process for farms, especially as we are growing to meet demand. But also in the non-animal side of our farm, the 15, 18 acres of vegetables we're growing and the cover crops that we're growing on the additional 15 to 20 acres that we try to rotate through, building organic matter through cover cropping is not a particularly high-tech methodology, but it does take planning and the ability to really think about which crops are all grown in a certain area together so that they can come off in time to get a cover crop on that will establish itself in time to be well rooted for the fall, through the winter to come back in the spring. And we're just cutting the rye now that we use for the bedding for the pigs, and we then spread back on the land after it's bedding and pig manure. That's not particularly high tech necessarily. I'm not using any satellites or GPS tractors to do this work. But cover crop seed costs money. The management, maybe getting a field crimper, is another tool that we don't have. And I'll tell a brief story, which is I heard from one of the biggest farms in the state, big conventional dairy farm, who, while doing their big nutrient management plans every year, which is a requirement of the state to try to reduce water pollution in the state, she called me and said, you know what, I just realized after 10 years of doing these nutrient management plans and soil tests, I just realized we've increased our organic matter by over 1% because they are using cover crops. One of my neighbor farms does this. They grow winter rye in the fall that they put on sometimes before or just after they harvest all that big fields of corn, GMO corn, chemical intensive agriculture corn. They put down cover crops. Now they've seeded their corn for this season, and their corn is this tall, and the grasses are this tall. And the next couple of weeks, they're going to spray down those cover crops with glyphosate, and they're going to expose the corn to be able to grow, and they're actually tilling the soil much less than those of us who use organic methods do. And they're building organic matter faster than some of us organic farmers, at least non-animal organic farmers, are able to do. And so I will put this out there. It's an internal conundrum for me as a real highly concerned person about GMO agriculture and monocrop agriculture, which is what GMOs are really all about. And yet they're building organic matter faster than I am as an organic farmer, because now they're tilling their soil less. They're carving the seeds into the ground. They're not tilling the soil, and they're spraying down the cover crop. It's a very interesting question that we all have to deal with to say, interesting, is the top priority now sequestering carbon and building organic matter in soils for the climate crisis, or is it not using chemicals in agriculture, and or is there a way to do both, which I think is that's the diamond we're all aiming for. But these are not as simple, I think, as I know I used to think they were in terms of that discussion. And it ultimately still goes back to, what are you willing to pay for your food? And do you need to buy perfect looking food? because as Theresa talked about at the opening, being with Salvation Farms, a lot of the food that they utilize is imperfect food. Well, we're such a aesthetic society, from how we dress to coif our hair to the style of whatever thing is holding our phone case to all this other stuff. And that aesthetic is carried over into food, and we want perfect looking food. Well, perfect looking food is often either less environmental or means less is coming to you at the market and more of it has to go into lower value outlets for the farmer. So what food are you picking up at the store? Are you willing to buy the blemished zucchini with a little cut in the side of it that healed, but the person that cut the zucchini just before it nicked it with a knife and it's got a little thing? Guess what? You never see that in a store. Where does that zucchini go? It goes in the compost pile. Perfectly edible food, or it goes to Theresa. But these are the individual decisions people need to make sustainable, regenerative, healthier food agriculture viable economically for the workers, for the farmers, for the land, and for the water, is the choices we're making as consumers every single day in terms of what we're willing to spend our money on, and are we willing to buy imperfect food. Sorry, kind of a rant.
We have about 8 minutes left. I'm guessing that the Slow Living Summit staff and support might want to say some things as we wrap up, but I'm going to ask one last question that was presented by an attendee, and it looks like as though it's about the CARES Act stimulus dollars. You know, what really can the USDA or federal government do under the stimulus beyond to help farmers? So I think we mentioned some of the things that we thought that funding could support. What other creative ways could we be using this funding right now? Do we know?
I guess I'll take that first maybe, but my understanding of the CARES Act money is primarily it has to be used for expenses incurred due to the coronavirus. So it doesn't have ultimate flexibility of, hey, we have $1.25 billion to build the economy we want. It's really to say, okay, the state took on extra expense housing homeless people. What was that expense? And how can we spend money to address homeless folks in the age of a coronavirus? And just today, the Senate passed a bill that allocated $20 million to VHCD or some other housing organizations to maybe build more permanent temporary housing for homeless folks to address coronavirus now and in the future. So that's a bill that's addressing a cost now, but maybe has a long-term support for us. Broadband is the kind of thing where we have huge inequity in education because schools are closed. So it's a coronavirus expense, but it might be a capital infrastructure that actually will benefit us all down the line as well. But most of the money is really going to just straight up costs in the moment, whether it's supplying food to those big long car lines, whether it's, you know, paying people who are out of work to get through, the ability to pay their bills so they can get back to work. Most of it is operational or in the moment money versus investment in infrastructure that is both addressing a current problem and will thankfully maybe be able to help us going forward. But we're still looking for creative ideas before that money is going surprisingly fast.
I believe it. I want to ask Lindsey and Caroline, in regards to the entire conversation, in your perspective, is there any final words you'd want to share before I hand it over to?
Well, I just also wanted to quickly respond just to that last question, because it is indeed what I'm currently working on most, is trying to really helping to develop a state stimulus program for ag and combining that with a long-term vision for agriculture in the state. So putting some, and what that incentive currently looks like is the sheer consideration of other farmers, non-diversified farmers potentially also being in need for this money. That already would be a policy shift. So what you might not believe, but the CARES state stimulus funding was really focused on dairy only, and creating that equity for diversified farmers and having the ability to make their case, that would be a policy shift already. So we're working on that, and if some money is left and there's really strong competition about it, then we hope to keep some reserve funds for the fall, because many diversified farmers don't know quite yet what their losses might be, and they can't make that case until the fall. But if the money is paid out on a first come first served basis, there's no money left in the fall if we don't save some for the fall. So that is one goal, and then the other one is, if there's additional money left, to put some in the hands of working lands. There's some money that is being discussed to put in the hands of Vermonters feeding Vermonters, and other food security based initiatives. So the latest draft has some language, the Senate Act draft has some language in that, and then of course we're continuously advocating for some relief funds for those who've been excluded from funding, including migrant workers.
And Theresa, to your question about the whole, regarding the whole panel, I think while I agree partially with David that a lot of this has to do with the consumers needing to shift their values and spend more on what they eat, which I agree wholeheartedly, we also have to address that there's a broken, well, it's not a broken food system. The food system is acting exactly as it's been designed to, and there are major inequalities, and there's a lot of hungry kids in the state, and there's still a lot of issues that the onus isn't entirely on the people. That's also on changing the system. So I think it's both.
And I hope you know I agree with you. I didn't mean to overlay it on one. So thank you for calling that out, though, for sure.
Thank you. What an honor to kind of help frame and support this conversation. You guys, gals, really delivered. Thank you.
Thank you, Theresa, for moderating today. And thank you all. I think, for me, the big takeaway, and certainly in the work that we've been doing here at Strolling, is that, these COVID has really just exposed some of the problems in the systems that we're all working within. And, it's going to go beyond that, that rapid response money that's coming in. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, after December, when all of that money dries up and, these farmers and food businesses that we're working with still need our help. So thank you all. This has been an amazing panel. Thank you, Lindsey. Thank you, David. Thank you, Caroline. And thank you, Theresa, for being here with us today. This recording will be available to all attendees on our website, probably within a week or so, depending on how fast we can get it up there. But I think that's it for today. And please, tomorrow we've got our cooperative panel. That's tomorrow at 1 o'clock, starts at 1 o'clock. So we hope you'll join us for that. And we've got our happy hour on Thursday. We hope some of you can join us for that happy hour on Thursday. It'll be another way for our attendees to ask some more follow-up questions and just, keep the conversation going, because that's really what this is all about. So thank you all so much. Thanks, Jen, for another great panel. Jen, the fabulous coordinator.
Thank you.
And thank you all. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you, Jen. Thanks, Theresa.
Thank you.
Have a good one.